Okay. All right. Today we're going to be talking about the action image, which is really the central piece in Volume 1 of Deleuze's two-volume work, Cinema. Remember, Volume 1 is subtitled The Motion Image. And for Deleuze, the motion image refers to one variety of time image. The second variety will occur in the second volume. So the first volume is about the motion image. The second volume is about what Deleuze calls the direct time image. The motion image is an indirect time image because it portrays or depicts the flow of time through the medium of motion. And of course, the motion picture is a good venue for this because what distinguishes the movie image, obviously, from other images is that the movie image moves. And so it's able to depict motion. But Deleuze's point is that time in the first flourishing of cinema, in particular in its American form, is shown under the same constraints that time is described under in the history of Western philosophy. So right back to the beginning, if you think about Aristotle, who is probably the most important thinker when it comes to the initial conceptualization of time, Aristotle defines time as the measure of motion. And this has to do with Aristotle's cosmology, which actually ruled in the West right down to the beginning of the modern period. Aristotle passed it on to Ptolemy, who was a Hellenic astronomer, and Ptolemy passed it on to the medievals, who adopted it and adapted it to the Catholic conception of the cosmos. But in all of these ideas, the Aristotelian, the Ptolemaic, and then the later Catholic version, the universe is a sphere. And of course, the Earth is at the center, and then the various elements are layered. So what you've got here is Earth at the very center, and then water surrounding the Earth, and then air surrounding the water, and then fire surrounding the air. And the fire, of course, refers to the fire of the heavenly bodies. And the heavenly bodies are arranged in concentric circles. There's a division between what the ancients called the planets, which means the wandering bodies, the bodies that recede on themselves over time, that don't make perfect circular orbits. And then there is the final sphere of the fixed stars. And the fixed stars are the celestial bodies that return to their original point after 365 days. And so, of course, the 365-day cycle is the cycle of the year. And the year is a measurement, it's a temporal conception. It's a segment of time, but the segment of time is measured by the motion of the heavenly spheres. And of course, the day is measured by the motion of the sun around the Earth in this this geocentric view of the cosmos. And then there are other divisions, monthly divisions that have to do with the behavior of the moon and so forth. So we look at the motions that are occurring in the heavens, and we're able to demarcate the basic spans of time. Well, similarly, the motion picture depicts motion, and it's through motion that it marks off and describes and deals with and analyzes, or whatever word you want to use, the basic segments of filmic time. Well, we know that the motion image breaks down into three components, or three versions, three varieties. There's the perception image, the affection image, and the action image. You can't take the divisions between these three images too strictly, because there's no film that doesn't include all three to some extent. The question is, what's dominant in a particular film? So, for example, in The Passion of Joan of Arc, it's the affection image that's dominant, even though there are clearly perception images and action images in the film as well. Action is occurring, there's an historical context in which it occurs, and obviously there are some medium shots that show us the perceptual layout of the world that Joan and her accusers inhabit. But that's not the center. That's not where the aesthetic weight of the image is. The aesthetic weight of the image is in the depiction of affect on Joan's face and on the face of her accusers. So there we have an affection image, even though there are perceptual and action elements mixed in. And similarly, in Vertov's movie, Man with a Movie Camera, there's action. There are people doing things. There are athletes engaging in athletic events, and there's a woman who gets up in the morning and gets ready for work and so forth, and all of these are actions. And there are even affective elements. We see emotion registered on the faces of people, but that's not where the critical mass of the film lies, or the specific weight of the film lies, to use another chemical metaphor. The specific weight of the film lies in the perception image. Now we're talking about a kind of film in which the critical weight is the action image. The action image dominates the film, even though there are affective and perceptual elements in the film. The form of movie making where the affection image is dominant is classical American film, Hollywood movies, and even a little bit before Hollywood, before the studio system was created, but it's certainly the kind of filmmaking that is dominant once the Hollywood studios are in action, and it lasts even to the current day, but begins to erode a bit from the 1960s on. And of course, the studio system itself begins to erode. As Pixels will tell us, Hollywood is not what it used to be. But in any event, the notion here is that it's the American film that achieves a kind of standard of excellence in the action image that is accepted globally. And it's accepted both by mass audiences and by film critics and by filmmakers, including European film critics and filmmakers. One of the interesting things, for example, that happened in French cinema right after the end of the Second World War was the aesthetic reevaluation of American cinema as a major contribution to film aesthetic. And so you had French filmmakers and French film critics and theorists studying American movies and incorporating them into the corpus of great works of cinematic art. But it actually didn't need to, for the French to come along for that to happen. We've already seen that Eisenstein, the great Soviet filmmaker, was deeply influenced by what's his name? The Intolerance, the director of Intolerance, T.W. Griffith. Yeah, Griffith. And so in any event, American film has had a significant role in global film aesthetics ever since it started. After the war, after the Second World War, it also began to invade mass markets all over the world. And so, for example, in the wake of the destruction of Europe after World War II, the European film industry was also in shambles. And Hollywood, in concert with the U.S. State Department, dumped old Hollywood films, musical comedies in particular, into the European market. And there was a tremendous desire to see these things. And actually, both in Italy and in France, it took state intervention. In France in particular, it took state intervention to limit American film entry into the foreign markets in order for the film industries of France and of Italy to revive. Well, what is it that makes American film exceptional by global standards? And it's what I called in an earlier lecture the legibility of American film. In other words, in American film, you always know where you are. You know where you are in the unfolding of the course of events, so you know where you are in time, and you know where you are in space. You know where you are in relation, or where the central character is, or even a minor character is in relation to other characters in the film. So space and time are described lucidly. And what this means, of course, is that the film audience doesn't have to exert any particular aesthetic powers in order to, or intellectual powers, in order to understand what's going on. And so this makes American movies the archetypal form of entertainment films. Because, I mean, you have to think about what films really are. They were the creation of the first mass visual art of the industrial age. And not just the first mass visual art, but the first form of mass urban entertainment, originally directed to a working class audience. And then later, middle class people began to become interested in film as well, and that sort of thing. But the idea was that people would come off of work after an exhausting day and go into the movie theater and relax, be entertained by the images that they saw. And of course, that kind of relaxation, that passive entertainment, requires the absolute legibility of the film image. Well, Deleuze doesn't say this, but this is my take on it, my context for thinking about Deleuze. For Deleuze, what characterizes American film is what he refers to as the action image. So what is the action image? Well, we've already seen the perception image and the affection image. And if you take a look at the affection image, if you take a look at the impulse image, which is midway between the affection image and the action image. The impulse image, remember, doesn't any longer concern itself with the play of emotions on the face or on the facial equivalents. It is concerned with impulses that discharge themselves. But the impulses discharge themselves into a particular kind of environment that Deleuze calls the originary world. And the impact of those impulsive discharges is fragmentation and what Deleuze calls fetishism. So we saw this illustrated very nicely in Exterminating Angel, in Louis Buñuel's movie. Well, what happens in the action image is that the impulses become coherent and organized forms of behavior. And the environment is no longer an originary world of fragments. It's a determinate geographical and historical environment. And so the idea is that you've got those two poles. You've got the pole of behavior and the pole of the milieu, or the environment. Of course, it's the film characters who occupy the pole of behavior. They're the ones who are going to act. But they act in relation to an environment that can be described with determinate accuracy. So, some nondescript household in the outskirts of maybe Madrid where crazy things happen, where the guests can't leave because they can't cross the threshold and so forth, that's not a determinate environment. A town in Montana, in an American Western, is a determinate milieu. It's got a geographical location, and it's got a temporal location. It's got an historical location. What characterizes the action image is the interaction between the mode of behavior and the environment. And so the way that Deleuze describes this is that the environment, first of all, is what he calls a great encompasser. And what he means by this is that the environment is impregnated with a set of physical and or historical qualities. So here we are in Montana, and it's the late, or maybe the mid-19th century. We're in a Western. And so the environment is both the, let's say, Montana, we've got some mountains, we have some more sparse parts of the landscape, we have an enormous sky, not much in the way, or at this point, nothing really in the way of urban development and so forth. So we have all of these geological and geographical elements, but we also have the historical environment of settlers trying to create an extension of the American nation, and all the actions that flow from that, and the conflicts that flow from that, the conflicts between different forces. There may be conflicts between the attempt to create a legal system and criminality. And so obviously the bandit is a key figure in Westerns. There might be conflicts between the white settlers and the native population. Many Westerns focus on the relationship between settlers and Indians in various ways. Even in the earliest Westerns. No, by no means is genocide simply advocated. There's a kind of nuanced attempt to deal with the problems of moving into someone else's territory and so on. And then, of course, there are other struggles that go on. There's struggles between cattlemen and farmers, which are actually historical struggles that occurred in the settlement of the West and so on. So the great encompasser, the environment as a great encompasser is impregnated with these forces. And it's through the environment that the individual actor acquires modes of behavior. In other words, modes of behavior are meaningless apart from the powers that are present in the accompanying environment. I'm just thinking on my feet. Let's take a film that has to deal with the collapse of a mine, and say that miners are trapped underground. And Colorado is a good place for this. All right, they're trapped in the mine. Well, what's happened here? There has to be some way of rescuing them, and there are going to be conflicts along the road of organizing a rescue. But without the encompasser, without the milieu setting the stage, there are mountains that are rich in metals of various kinds that can be exploited by people, and they act in order to do that, and the mine collapses in the course of action, and then there has to be a rescue organized by a group of people in order to prevent the deaths of the miners. All of this is the result of the impregnation of the individual actor by the forces in what Deleuze calls the great encompasser. There are two paths along which this connection between behavior or action, properly, narrowly so-called, and the environment or the milieu, there are two paths that it takes. Deleuze describes both of them as spirals. And they're spirals rather than just circles because they expand. In other words, they move in a certain direction. Things change as a result of spiral motion, whereas circular motion just returns to its origin, its original place, without change. But in action films, there's change in general. And so there's a spiral that begins with the environment and then spirals in on the person who's acting, who responds to the challenges that environmental forces create. But then there's another spiral that begins with the actor and with the actor's action without an encompassing context, but then has an impact. That action has an impact on the environment so that the general path of the film spirals from the actor outward to his impact on the environment. Deleuze has a way of describing this in simple algebraic terms. He calls the first spiral. First of all, he calls it the large form, and here he's working off of language that was developed by Niels Birch, who was a critic in a different context. But he calls this the spiral from the encompasser, or from the environment to the actor, the large form. And he calls the spiral from the actor to the environment the small form. The large form is expressed with the letters S, A, S prime. S, A, S prime. So what S, A, S prime means is that you begin with an encompassing situation. That the encompassing situation elicits action, and the action changes the situation. So the S that you begin with is different than the S that you end with. That's the significance of the S prime. It's also possible to reverse this, and now we begin with the action. So the person acts, and the action creates an impact on the environment, and then the environment feeds that impact back into the actor. So what you have here is ASA, or ASA prime. You begin with an action, it has an impact on the milieu, and the milieu then acquires new forces which feedback into the action. The second one is a little harder to grasp, but let me just give you an example, and that is the comedy of Charlie Chaplin. Deleuze, in fact, references Chaplin later on in the book, and a part of it that I didn't assign. But the idea here is that Chaplin is often involved in acting in such a way that he's not responding to environmental impulses. The action that Chaplin engages in is almost a, well, first of all, it's burlesque. It's a burlesque. It's an action that has a kind of crazy logic of its own, but usually involved in some misperception of what's happening, of what's going on. You know, he'll turn to speak to someone whom he thinks is a friend of his, and it turns out to be, I don't know, it turns out to be a wealthy man, and he ends up becoming a friend of the wealthy man who happens to be drunk. So the wealthy guy takes him home, and he gets involved in a whole bunch of adventures and so forth. So Chaplin's action is what initiates a change, in this case, in the environment that the wealthy man lives in. That is the scenario of a Chaplin film, by the way. What is it? Is it City Lights? I forget. But in any event, this happens in one of Chaplin's movies. And so what you get here, and then, of course, as things change in the environment, in the case of this particular film, the wealthy man sobers up. And so who the hell is this guy living with him? You know, who's this crazy tramp who's living in his house? His milieu has changed. And so he acts in such a fashion, calls the police or throws Chaplin out, and now Chaplin has to act again in relation to these new environmental forces that are the result of his initial action. This is an A prime, right? It's a small form of the action image film. Let's go back to the large form, because the large form is the one that made American film classical. And there are a number of genres where this happens. For example, the gangster movie is one place that it happens, and in particular, the film noir of the 1940s and early 1950s. The Bogart movies, where Bogart plays the Raymond Chandler character, Sam Spade, and a whole bunch of related films. These are classical examples of SAS or SAS prime films. But they take second place to the major genre in which this structure is developed, and that's the American Western. And I think we have a little bit of trouble now relating to Westerns, but Westerns dominated American movies for the longest period of time. It really wasn't until the 1960s and a little bit after that interest in Westerns began to wane. And they did not wane, by the way, before a second flourishing in the Western. You could say that the Western divides up into two great periods. One is the classical Western of Ince, of Hawks, and of Ford. And then there is the new Western that begins in the 1960s and 1970s, and the directors associated with this are Arthur Penn, let's see, the fellow who made the, what's his name, Sergio Leone, the Italian, who made the so-called spaghetti Westerns, but also Sam Peckinpah, and there are a few others as well. And the new Western begins to challenge some of the presuppositions of the old Western without radically breaking its form. So you get a challenge, for example, reevaluation of the place of Indians in a movie like Arthur Penn's Little Big Man. Little Big Man is one in which the white settlers end up as the negative force, and the native population is the positive pole, and so forth, which is a reverse of some of the scenarios in the classical Western. And you also get the films by Peckinpah in which what used to be heroes now seem to be pretty much nothing but violent thugs, right? So there's a reevaluation of the nature of the cowboy, for example. And this carries on into recent film like Brokeback Mountain, which introduces the homoerotic theme into cowboy life. But nonetheless, after the early flowering of the neo-Western, Westerns began to wane. People lost interest. But they did dominate a long period in the history of American filmmaking. And I think Deleuze puts his finger on this. Why was it that they were dominant? Well, they were dominant because they told the story of the birth of the American nation. And so in this sense, even though Birth of a Nation is not a Western, Birth of a Nation is D.W. Griffith's movie about the aftermath of the Civil War. Even though this doesn't take place in the South, Griffith raises the question of what is the United States, what is the nation, and how does it reconstitute itself and preserve itself and reconstitute itself in the face of crises? In this case, the greatest crisis in the history of the U.S., namely the Civil War. We know that Griffith's answer was less than wholesome. Griffith lionizes the KKK in that movie, which will bring me back to a second theme here in a minute. He lionizes the KKK, but nonetheless, he poses the question. Well, Westerns also pose this question. What is the American nation? And so as the movement of settlers westward occurs, America has got to be reconstituted constantly in the founding of new towns, ultimately new cities, and the extension of the nation from coast to coast. Well, first of all, this question has to be imposed by the encompasser, by the environment, by the milieu, right? So one way that it can be posed is that, for example, in a film that John Ford did called Wagon Train, the problem is posed when three different groups of people, three different ethnicities, are traveling in the same wagon train to a new settlement. And so one of the ethnicities is sort of Scotch-Irish. Another is perhaps Mexican. Another, I forget the details of the Ford movie, but they're a group of gypsies. They're a group of, I think maybe a group of Latinos, actually. And then the Scotch-Irish. They're all on the wagon train. And so what do they have to do? They have to learn how to bridge their differences in order to enter into the great melting pot that is America. And I think that we sometimes don't understand just how unique the United States truly is globally. I often think of its uniqueness as to its detriment, but there's a part of its uniqueness that is in some way a vision of the future, and that is that the United States is not, in spite of what Donald Trump would like us to believe, it's not a nation created by an ethnicity. The myth, perhaps, of the melting pot is a way of putting this, but there is obviously a far more diverse population, a far more distinctive set of peoples living on this continent than any other nation in the world. You know, James and I are both at UMass, or James actually graduated from UMass, but you can see it at my university. There are a ton of people from all over the world, and from every possible, racial background, if race has any meaning at all, and so on. So you've got this tremendously varied population of immigrants. And the task has always been to create a nation out of this mass. And so what Europe is finding so difficult right now, for example, the United States has been dealing with for a long time. When you have Syrians moving into Germany, that's an issue because Germany didn't grow up that way. Germany was not the United States. Germany was not a collection of radically different ethnicities who had to create a common nation out of that variety. Germany had a certain ethnic homogeneity. And so to break that now means, I think that's Anna's mic that's giving me trouble. I just muted it, and I seem to have lost you. Can people hear me still? Can people hear me? No? What's the problem now? Okay, let's see here. There we go. Okay, I'm back. All right, so in any event, In any event, the arrival of Syrians in Europe has posed a problem of tremendous proportions. American anti-immigration sentiment has been a part of the United States since it was founded, but even in its most grotesque version, which is that of Donald Trump and the current implosion of the Republican Party, it still doesn't reach the depths of the crisis that Europe is facing, and absorbing a population that is radically different than the so-called indigenous population. It's been happening for a while, but still the massive number of Syrians that are coming in are posing a difficulty. Well, the United States has been grappling with that ever since its founding, because there's nobody native to the continent except the natives, and they were largely wiped out or confined to small areas, to reservations and so forth. And so the task of the United States has always been one of making a functional nation out of a group of people who come from radically different backgrounds. How is that even possible? Well, that gets posed anew as Americans move from the East to the West. And so the Western is constantly recapitulating the story of national origins. How do you take this group and wield it into something that has a unity? Now, Deleuze makes a comment which I think is very interesting, and that is, he says it's easy to ridicule American films, and it's easy to ridicule Westerns for what seem to be their naive character. Because what's constantly being replayed in the Western is the recreation of what's known as the American dream. Right? And the American dream is the dream that people who were caught in a rigid class system in their countries of origin, who were as often as not on the lower levels of the class structure, could move to the United States and make their way. They could recreate lives that were fulfilling in this new world, right? And so a lot of the national story gets told this way, and the idea of the American dream is still significant, even in this cynical period that we're in. Well, what Deleuze says is he actually refers to Nietzsche here. Deleuze doesn't quote Nietzsche, doesn't use this quote, but it came to mind with me. At one point, Nietzsche says that truth is that kind of an illusion without which it's impossible to live. Truth is that kind of an illusion without which it's impossible to live. In other words, truth doesn't refer here to the correspondence of statements with facts or with reality. Truth, the truth of a great ideology, or the truth of a great religion, or the truth of a great philosophy, is how does it provide people with the landmarks to get their bearings, to move through life in a directed way? How does it provide them with that, or are those bearings in the process of disintegration? A healthy illusion is one that provides people with those bearings, and a sick illusion is one in which the bearings are disintegrated. And so the question is not, is the American dream true or false, which I think is often the way that leftists look at it. You take the American dream and you compare it with the reality, and it's obviously out of sync. There's a big distinction between top and bottom, and some people are caught in the bottom and so forth. But the point is, does the idea give people a way of organizing their lives and a direction to go in that enables them to make sense out of their lives? That's the real question. And so the question is not so much a political one as a moral one or a spiritual one. Is the dream functioning, or isn't it? Well, there's a whole set of films about the dream failing to function. To function for one reason or another. For example, the Gangster film is a classical example. Let's see here. I'm getting a little feedback, so I'm just trying to, let's see if that helps. Yeah, I think it was Anna's mic. Yeah, it's off now. It's gone now. Okay. All right. the gangster film, the film about the alcoholic. Think about what is it? Movie that Jack Lemmon was in, Days of Wine and Roses, in which the life of the bar goer is depicted, and someone whose life spirals out of control because of their alcoholism. But then, of course, there are also people whose lives spiral out of control because of their loss of any moral compass and their perverse reading of the American dream. This is what The Godfather's about, right? I mean, The Godfather is about a family of immigrants who come to the United States who, and in fact, in the first phase, are able to prosper because of their tight family ties. Of course, the family is not just the immediate family, it's the mafia family that Vito Corleone creates in the United States. And then the collapse of that family over the course of the next two films is about the unsustainability of the American dream in that version, right? And so the gangster film is a classic example of the disintegration of the dream, or the way in which the dream fails. In the Western, the dream is presented with the possibility of failure. But normally, until the neo-Western comes along, the action of the main character responding to the problems that permeate the environment, that permeate the encompasser, leads to a situation in which the obstacle presented by the environment is overcome. And so this is another element of the SAS prime formula that Deleuze emphasizes, and that namely this relationship, this dynamic relationship between environment and actor, between encompasser and behavior, results in a duality, in a bifurcation, in what he calls a binomial, namely a duel, a contest between two forces. One of those forces is represented obviously by the hero of the film or the heroine of the film. And the other force can be posed by a variety of elements. Let's get concrete and talk about The Man Who Killed Liberty Valance, which is a John Ford movie. It's a little bit later than most of Ford's films, but Ford, remember, is one of the classic creators of the American Western. And the Man Who Killed Liberty Valance, well, what's the context in which the movie occurs? I'm asking this question of the people present in the session now, rather than as a rhetorical question. What's the setting for the movie? In other words, how could you characterize what Deleuze calls the encompasser in this film? Anybody seen the movie?
Well, it's the American West and kind of the original, I guess, lawlessness of the West. I see this as kind of the prime arc, is the lawlessness being replaced by law and order.
It's certainly true.
That's certainly a big part of it, I guess.
Right. All right. So the scenario is that there's a Western town, and in the beginning of the film, we see two characters, James Stewart, played by Jimmy Stewart, and I forget who plays his wife. But the two characters in the film are a U.S. senator from the state that we're in, and the senator's wife. And they're due to arrive in town, and they do in fact arrive in town. Actually, they arrive in town to the surprise of the townspeople and the surprise of the newspaper that is going to end up interviewing them and covering the story. They've come in to attend the funeral of a friend of theirs. And the town is a town that they lived in at one point in their lives and at a critical point in their youth. They're met by a character played by the character actor Andy Devine, who appears in a number of westerns. Very interesting guy. But Andy Devine meets them, and Andy Devine, it turns out, was once the sheriff of the town. when the local town's paper learns that the senator has come for a visit, it's a major story for them. So they set up, the editor sets up an interview with Stewart. And so Jimmy Stewart, the Stewart character, the senator, goes to the office of the newspaper and allows himself to be interviewed. And his wife travels on a wagon with Andy Devine to visit a place that's described vaguely by Devine. And then when they get to the location, what we see is that it's a ranch house that's been burned to the ground. It's just the remnants of a ranch house that was lost to a fire. And there's a garden present that's in disarray and so forth. And I think it's at that point that we see Devine pick some roses from the garden, some desert roses. Then the scene changes, and we're in now the funeral parlor, the place where the undertaker is going to be, has dressed the body of the friend who has died. And there's a black man who's present in the funeral who seems to be the only mourner. And Stewart looks at the body of his friend. We don't see it, but he looks at the body of his friend and he says to the undertaker, "Where are his boots?" Well, the undertaker has removed the boots in order to sell them, and Stewart insists that the undertaker put the boots back on. His wife goes up to the black man and embraces him. They know each other from the past, and the tone, though, is one of, how can I put it, of strangely. This is a small town, but strangely, no one seems to know who the dead person is or why it is that his death was significant. And this comes out in particular through the coverage that the newspaper offers to the senator. They don't really know why the senator's in town, whose death he's mourning. They're confused. They're really not particularly aware who the body is, and that sort of thing. So at that point, just as they're beginning the process of mourning, the editor of the newspaper comes in and he insists on an interview. The senator is news. What happens in the life of the senator is news, and he has an obligation as a senator to let his constituents know what's going on. And so Stewart is initially conflicted, and then he says, I guess you're right. I guess you do have a right to know what's going on. And he sits down and he relates the story. And it's the story that takes him back about, I don't know, Stewart and his wife seem to be about 60 or so, 60, 65 years old, and the story takes them back to their 20s. And Stewart is a young attorney who is just out of law school. His wife is working in a hotel kitchen as a cook. And the hotel is, it's a friendly place, and everybody eats there, and everybody knows one another, and so on. Stewart is on a wagon. Once again, you're on the wagon heading out west, heading into this new territory. The town has been recently created, and Stewart is, the wagon is held up by a bandit, and by a group of bandits led by a character played by the actor Lee Marvin. And Lee Marvin beats Stewart viciously when Stewart tries to come to the assistance of a woman who's one of her items of jewelry that her dead husband gave her has been stolen by one of the bandits. She wants it back. Stewart intervenes to protect her, and he gets mercilessly beaten to the point of being unconscious by the Lee Marvin character. The next step in the film is that John Wayne, who has been sort of ambivalently courting Stewart's future wife, appears in the hotel with Stewart in his arms. Stewart is still unconscious, and so he lays them in a bed in the hotel, and the people in the hotel nurse Stewart back to conscious awareness. And Stewart, of course, wants to, first of all, and here's where the theme that Mac was talking about comes in. Stewart wants to see Marvin and his band prosecuted for theft and for assault. But it becomes clear, and John Wayne is the vehicle for letting Stewart know this, it becomes clear that that's not the way things are done here. There's no legal apparatus. Or there is a legal apparatus, but the legal apparatus has no force at all. The sheriff is Andy Devine, and if you can picture who Andy Devine is, who the character actor is, Andy Devine is the opposite of the macho lawman who's able to, he's not the Gary Cooper. He's the anti-Gary Cooper. And so Devine isn't going to be able to enforce the law in this town. And there isn't any legal structure anyway to speak of. There's a circuit judge that comes around once a month or something like that, but the legal system is not functioning. And so John Wayne tells Stewart that here we settle our own problems. And of course, Wayne is the man who is a man. Now, you're going to see that the film is a little bit different than I think the one that, Anna, you say that it's a setting set in the Old West where men were men. Yeah, but that's not really the outcome of the film, because Jimmy Stewart is not a man's man. Jimmy Stewart avoids conflict. He criticizes the fact that, yes, he criticizes frontier justice. Remember, at one point after he is revived, he goes to work as a waiter in the hotel in order to pay back the people who have been paying for his food and board and his medical care all this time. And Marvin comes into the hotel with his gang. And Stewart will not stand up to Marvin. I mean, he'll talk to Marvin directly and tell him that that he committed a crime, that he wants to prosecute him, but he won't fight him. And he criticizes John Wayne, for being so quick to go to his fists and his gun. Wayne gets into the fight, or the near fight, and Stewart objects to this. So really what you have here is two characters. The John Wayne character is the man's man. John Wayne always plays the man's man. Stewart is the intellectual Easterner, the lawyer who's possessed of a moral vision and a vision of law as the key to the creation of the nation. Because without law, you don't have, first of all, you don't have safety, but secondly, you also don't have democracy. And we see this later on when an election is held and Lee Marvin, acting in the interests of the wealthy cattlemen, tries to prevent the vote from occurring in a democratic fashion. In other words, he tries to intimidate the voters into voting in the interests of the cattlemen. Well, in any event, the counterpoint between Stewart and John Wayne is, I think, at the center of the film. So it's a counterpoint both in gender roles and also in the issue of legality that Mac was talking about. So Wayne is the man's man who is an advocate and perfectly comfortable with the law of the frontier, right? And the law of the frontier is that you've got your gun strapped to your waist and you use that to defend your rights. It's what Hobbes called the war of each against all, right? And so just as in Hobbes, we don't make the transition from that to the creation of a state unless we're able to enter into a social contract that replaces the use of individual brute force with the creation of a social agent that has the consent of the people who are governed by it. And this is, of course, the state in Hobbes. At least it's a sort of a little too democratic a version of Hobbes. But nonetheless, this is the version of Hobbes that makes sense in relation to the film. So the question is really, how are the people of the town going to enter their social contract? How are they going to be able to put aside the war of each against all in exchange for the development of a legal system that ensures safety but also ensures democratic rule? And so we have here a core part of the national myth. Democracy is the rule of law. And so, okay. So Well, the way it gets played out, of course, is that after Stewart arranges for an election, and the election is going to be won by the farmers who are in opposition to the cattlemen. And the reason why is that there are far more farmers than there are cattlemen. The cattlemen are the economic elite. The farmers are the sort of hardworking stiffs, and they outnumber the cattlemen by a large majority. So any democratic election is going to bring to power the farmers and not the cattlemen. And so the cattlemen hire Lee Marvin and his crew in order to prevent a democratic outcome to the election. But the people in the meeting stand up to Martin, and instead of electing Martin, they elect the editor of the newspaper, the then editor of the newspaper, and Jimmy Stewart as delegates to a convention to discuss the entrance of Texas into the Union. Texas is not yet a part of the United States. It's going to be annexed by the United States. It's going to want to be annexed by the U.S. And so this is a convention trying to determine whether or not that's going to happen. The joining of the American nation, in other words, the outcome that in favor of the farmers means the creation of a legal system, because it brings this Texas town within the context of the United States. And so this is what the cattlemen do not want, because it's only under the rule of the law of the frontier and the law of immediate violence that they can prevail. They cannot prevail under a legal system, and they cannot prevail under a democratic system. And by the way, this is a myth, because what has happened, I mean, the contemporary cattlemen have prevailed. They rule, and they rule through a legal system, and they rule through what seems to be a democratic system. This is what the Sanders campaign was all about. But nonetheless, we're talking here about a myth. And so remember, an illusion, truth is an illusion without which people cannot live. The question is the illusion healthy, or is it diseased? And so here we're going to find out, is the illusion healthy or is it diseased? But this is where the film becomes subtle, and I think it's the twist that makes The Man Who Killed Liberty Valance a film that's well worth watching, and that is that Lee Marvin calls Stewart out. And what this means in the Old West is that we're going to have a gunfight. And the gunfight, by the way, Deleuze tells us, is the classical form of the duel. Right? We've got two forces, and one of the forces is the hero, or the heroine, well, the hero in this case. One of the forces is the hero, and the other is in general, is the thief, the corrupt gunslinger, whoever, the force that is in which the negative part of the encompassing environment focuses itself as a force. And that force has got to be faced and met and overcome in order for the action to be conducted to a successful conclusion. And so Marvin calls out Jimmy Stewart, but of course Stewart doesn't know how to fire a gun. He goes to John Wayne's ranch, which we now know was the ranch that we saw earlier in the film that was burned. He goes to John Wayne's ranch, and John Wayne tries to show him that he doesn't have the ability to fight this guy successfully, and he does it by shooting, using his own sharpshooting abilities to shoot cans of paint that then cover Jimmy Stewart with paint. And Stewart earns John Wayne's respect by, and here's Anna's thing, by punching him, by knocking him down with a single punch. Well, now Stewart has proven his credentials, right? So he's acceptable to John Wayne, who represents the law of the West. But John Wayne realizes that there's no way that Jimmy Stewart can prevail in the gunfight. Well, what we see in the original gunfight is Stewart facing down Lee Marvin. Marvin gets the draw on him, fires, hits Stewart in the arm, and then Stewart is able to collect his wits, fire back, and kill Marvin. So in other words, he plays the role that John Wayne had recommended from the beginning. He's then sent to the convention, in Houston, I guess it is, and the convention to discuss the Texas entry into the Union. And at the convention, he becomes disgusted with what got him there, especially since the cattlemen have an orator whom they've hired, who's played by John Carradine, another great character actor. Carradine accuses Stewart of, it says that Stewart's only credential for being at the convention is the fact that he killed a man. And this gets to Stewart. And so Stewart gets up and he leaves the convention. And he doesn't want any part of it anymore. And John Wayne, who has, unbeknownst to Stewart, has come to the convention, stops him. And he takes him aside into a separate room and says, you know, you're feeling bad because you killed this guy in a gunfight, but you didn't kill him. And then we see the same gunfight replayed again. And this is a technique that Deleuze tells us Ford invented, the playing of a scene twice. And the first time the scene is misunderstood, and it's necessarily misunderstood due to the way that it's shot. And the second time the scene is shot from a different angle, and we understand the significance of the scene. So the recollection that that John Wayne leads Stewart to, he says, remember when Lee Martin came out, and walks them back over this. And then we see that the actuality is that John Wayne is hiding in the shadows. And that when Stewart is shot by Lee Marvin, Wayne reacts. And so when Stewart fires his gun, Wayne simultaneously fires his own. He's got a rifle, and he kills Lee Marvin. And Wayne says so now we come back to the present. And Wayne says to Jimmy Stewart, I can live with it. I can live with having done this. Now get back inside and vote. And it's not just his vote, it's the fact that he is the charismatic leader of the farmers in the convention. Get back in there and vote, and Stewart goes back in. Well, of course, the fact that Stewart goes back in is what brings him to the Senate. But what brings him to the Senate is a lie. It's an illusion. But it's an illusion without which Texas cannot become a member of the Union. It's the illusion without which there cannot be a resolution to this problem. It's an illusion without which the action that was initiated by the gunfight cannot be brought to a conclusion. It's the illusion without which it's impossible to go further, it's impossible to live. It's the Nietzschean truth in that sense. It's the Nietzschean truth. So Stewart doesn't disavow the fact that he is the man who killed Liberty Valance, even though he is not. He's elected. First of all, he prevails in the convention. Texas becomes a state in the Union. Stewart becomes its multiply re-elected senator. He spends some time as governor of the state. He's at the political center of this creation. And it's a lie. But it's a lie that functions as a truth. In other words, it's the equivalent of the American dream here. Once again, the question isn't, is the American dream true or false? The question is it capable of doing what it's supposed to do? And so once you ask the question in those terms, you have a different sort of calculus for figuring out things politically. And of course, we come back to the present. And so Stewart is done relating his tale to the editor of the newspaper. And then he says, well, I guess you have a right to print that. And the editor refuses to print it. And the editor makes the point that I've just made, is that we need our illusions. We need our myths. And this is really the ultimate, this is how can you put it? It's the moral of the story, right? It's the moral of the story. I mean, there's heroism, of course, here. There's Jimmy Stewart's willingness to stand up to Lee Marvin, even though it's likely to lead to his death. But there's a distortion of historical reality in the interest of the creation of a new history. And this is what This is what Ford's point is. And if you look at it retrospectively, you know, in other words, if you take if you take the insight that's given to us in this film and you reapply it to the whole history of Ford as a creator of the Western, I think what you get is a very profound reading of the Western. Is that it was never meant to be true to life. You know, it was never meant to recapture the historical reality. It was meant to construct a myth that's a part of the national myth. Let's return to 2016. What do we have? We're at a point which is as historically fraught with conflict, certainly, as the moment in the history of Texas that's described in the film. We're witnessing a very unusual event in American history, namely an implosion, a breakup, a disintegration of one of the two parties. Now, this hasn't happened since really the Civil War. Well, it certainly hasn't happened since the rise of the Republican Party, the prominence, and then its functioning as a vehicle of the anti-slavery forces, the party of Nixon and so forth. But what we've seen here is the Republican Party go through several reincarnations, from the party of Lincoln to the party of Nixon. What does Nixon do? Well, Nixon, by the way, is to the left functionally of Obama, certainly far to the left of Obama. He offered a guaranteed annual income called the negative income tax, which would now be called rank communism by the Republicans. But he is the one who is responsible for the so-called Southern strategy, where the Republican Party opens up to the disaffected white voters of the South, the voters who have been alienated from the Democrats because of their association with the civil rights movement. And so the Republican Party takes on a constituency that used to be represented by racist Democrats in the South. And we get a party realignment, a certain amount of realignment. And then what happens? Well, in 1980, we have the purging of the liberal elements in the Republican Party that still flourished under Nixon. And we have the transition from the party of Nixon to the party of Reagan. And so we even have Rubio able to actually, with a straight face, talk about the party of Lincoln and Reagan, as though that were a possible single party. You know, there were two revolutions between the party of Lincoln and the party of Reagan. But in any event, you got the party of Reagan, and Reagan dominates the political reality right through Obama. And he sets the stage politically. But, of course, Reaganism doesn't work. The radical redistribution of wealth to the top doesn't solve any of the problems of American capitalism. It exacerbates the problem of keeping the American dream viable because people feel like they can't prosper, they can't get out of the slough that they're in, that there's this weight on top of them, whether the weight is the weight of the corporate elite or whether it's the weight of the government bureaucrats. Something is smothering the American dream. Right? So what do the Republicans do about it? Well, there's another force that enters, and that's the Tea Party. Right? And what does the Tea Party do? The Tea Party takes conservatism and it pushes it to the loony fringe and to the point of refusing to play the political game of compromise in the interest of getting things done. And so what you get is a Congress that is incapable of acting, that's at loggerheads with the president, in this case President Obama. And then the final act in this tragedy is, of course, Donald Trump. Trump is not a member of the Tea Party. Trump is not a Reaganite. Trump is, people have been calling him a fascist. I think that's accurate and it's inaccurate. It's accurate in that his ideology is fascist. In other words, he is a nativist, he's a racist, even though in the American politics you can't quite come out and say it directly. He said it about as directly as it's possible to say. Refused to disavow David Duke or the KKK He didn't know what the KKK was or who David Duke was. It was a load of shit, right? Everybody knows that he knew Duke. He had already spoken directly about Duke and so forth. His son gives an interview to the Political Cesspool, which is a radio program run by a white supremacist. Their past members, people who have gone to the program to be interviewed, were neo-Nazis, Holocaust deniers, and so forth. And of course, so you've got the xenophobia, the racism, the anti-immigration sentiment, and you also have the Führerprinzip, in other words, the leader principle, right? We don't know how we're going to get out of this, but he's a great leader. Going to make America great again. Doesn't matter what he says. And actually, historical fascism was not particularly interested in constructing a coherent ideology. What they wanted was power, and they wanted power on the basis of a leader principle, and also on the basis of a mass party. And this is where Trump deviates from the fascist tradition, because not only did historical fascism need a mass party, but it needed gangs of thugs organized in the streets, battling and destroying the political opposition through direct violence. And so this is in the mobilizing phase of fascism, and in the phase of fascism that comes after the fascists achieve power, there's the creation of a police state. And I don't see Trump, at least not yet, doing either of those latter things. So I would say that Trump is a fascist ideologically, but not the full European variety. However, he comes as close to fascism as we've come in the United States, certainly on the part of a major political candidate. Can't find anybody in American history that's remotely like him unless you go back to Father Coughlin in the 1930s, the right-wing Catholic priest who had the radio program and so forth, anti-Semite and so on. This is what Trump represents. But he represents this figure who comes out of the disease of the American dream. The fact that it's no longer believed. That, oh, and by the way, James, I was thinking of this too. The one part of it that people cling to, and they're starting to realize that it's not anything to cling to, but the thing that they cling to is the myth that a higher education will deliver the American dream. The polling all shows this. It's the one element of the American dream that people still indicate an allegiance to in polls. That if they can just get their kids educated, they will do fine. Of course, the job structure doesn't permit it. There aren't enough jobs for people with degrees and the whole bit. But so what we see here is a disintegrating American dream. And so what is Trump's central claim? He's going to make America great again. He's going to restore the American dream by purifying the nation, by keeping the Mexican rapists out, by preventing the Muslims from getting in, and so on and so on and so on.
Yes, it does sound like racial purification.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a Yankee Doodle version of it, but it's definitely there. It's definitely a part of his package. Anna says that the next bubble will be the student loans. Yeah, I think so, except it's a little bit different. The housing bubble was money owed to banks. Student loans is money owed to the feds, most of it, the vast majority of it, about 90% of it. But that still has a bearing on the budget, the federal budget deficit, and so. But you're right. There's no way that students are going to be able to shoulder the $1.2 trillion in debt that they're now in. That's absolutely right. But I thought it was interesting, though, that we watched this film a couple days after the Republican Super Tuesday, and the aftermath of that. So let's see. James, you got to go? It was good.
I do. I read that same story about a guy who got arrested for not paying his student loans.
Oh.
I have to go. It was a fascinating movie. I will see you next week.
Okay, James. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So let's see. Pixel says, I recently read a story about a guy who was arrested for not paying back his student loans. Student loan that was 20 years old. Yeah. Yeah. They don't play with you. Although the feds are quite happy to sell student debt to collectors agencies at a fraction of the cost, and then have the collection agencies go after the full value. Of course, you would think that if they just charged the students the reduced value of the loan, it would have a beneficial effect all around. But of course, they don't. Well, in any event, I did think it was interesting that this movie intersected in a way with our current political reality. That is prison. Yeah. Let's see. Right. Well, yeah, which then private prisons profit from. Yeah. Well, there are all kinds of scams that have been run. The cattlemen have been ruling us for quite a while, I'm afraid. Now they run the prison system for profit, as well as everything else. Unfortunately, I can't continue for the 2 hours today. Let's see, from cows to convicts, right? I can't continue for the 2 hours today. My wife and I have an appointment to see an old friend who's been out of the country. But I think you get the idea of what the action image is and what its significance is in Deleuze's work. Let me just say one last thing, and that is the transition from book 1 to book 2 is going to hinge on something which is the how can I put it? It's the collapse of the action image. It's the inability of the action image to structure cinema anymore. And that's represented by the transition from Deleuze's emphasis on classical American cinema to post-war European modernist cinema. And so, but there's a figure who stands in between those two, between the action image and the collapse of the action image and the beginning of what Deleuze calls a direct time image. In other words, from American to European film. And that transitional figure is Alfred Hitchcock. And so the interesting thing about Hitchcock is that Hitchcock portrays situations in which action breaks down, in which it's no longer efficacious, in which the central character, the hero, can no longer read the cues that the environment provides, can no longer understand the forces that are at play, and therefore can no longer act in such a way as to overcome the obstacles that are posed by the film. And the next step will be the abandonment of the action image entirely. But Hitchcock still has one foot solidly planted in the world of, the idiom of American filmmaking. And so he presents the crisis of the action image, but in the language of a cinema that has been dominated by the action image. And the film that we're going to be watching to illustrate this, I think, is just as apt as watching the Man Who Killed Liberty Valance in relation to the action image. And that is, we're going to see Vertigo, in which we find once again Jimmy Stewart in the lead role. Alfred Hitchcock's great film Vertigo. And so we'll watch that for next week, and we'll discuss the crisis of the action image, and then the following week we'll be on to book 2. So I'm sorry that I can't hang around. It would be interesting to have an extended conversation about all of this. But I've got about 5 more minutes, and then I've got to go. Did anybody want to say anything in the last 5 minutes?
Is Vertigo next week? I thought there was one other one.
Is there, Mac? Let me see. I thought it was Vertigo.
I think we do like the small form of the action image, maybe. Oh,
that's right. That's right. I'm sorry. Yes, we're taking a look at actually what we're taking a look at this. This is kind of fun. It's kind of comic relief. It's literally comic relief. We're taking a look at the 3 concepts that Deleuze gets from Charles Sanders Peirce, the 3 logical properties of firstness, secondness, and thirdness. But we're doing it in relation to comedy. So we're going to be taking a look at the work of the Marx Brothers, of Laurel and Hardy, and is it Harold Lloyd? No, it's not Harold Lloyd. It's another comic film actor. His name is escaping me at the moment. But we're going to be taking a look at that. There are only two films that we're going to be seeing. They're both relatively short, And then there is a collection of film clips from the Marx Brothers. And so, for my audience at UMass, the whole thing amounts to 18 pages of reading, and we're gonna be able to spread it over 2 weeks. So it's like, do the damn reading. So in any event, yeah, and then you're right, Mac. It's the following week that we're going to be doing Vertigo. So we'll get a little comic relief after Super Tuesday. We all need it. So we'll watch the Marx Brothers films and so on and talk about that tomorrow. Okay, folks, it was good being with you again. I'm sorry that I have to call this short, but I'll see you next week. Okay. Take care now.
Okay.
Bye.